Hello everyone. Today's case is intertwined with Kimberly McAndrew's case, so I definitely recommend watching that case first before you watch this one. And that's because similar suspects would be considered in both cases. But this time, an 18-year-old girl would fly across the country to scope out potential colleges, but instead, she would disappear from the airport. 18-year-old Andrea King was born on December 15th of 1973 to her parents Wayne and Ann King. She also had two sisters named Deborah and Maria. Andrea was described as a loving, caring person who never passed up a challenge and cared about the lives of others. She was said to be mature and level-headed. When Andrea was just 11 years old, she told her parents that they should become foster parents because they were such great parents and had such a large house. Eventually, their parents had moved to Surrey, British Columbia. Andrea wanted to stay and finish out her final year of high school, so she decided to move in with her sister Maria into an apartment in New Westminster, an area of the Vancouver Metro. The sisters would often swap jewelry, clothing, and makeup. Maria loved to borrow Andrea's brown leather gladiator sandals, however, she would never let her keep them. And Andrea would end up doing exactly what she said. She actually graduated high school with honors, while also working full-time at the local Greyhound bus depot. After Andrea turned 18, she decided she wanted to fly across the country to Nova Scotia to scope out potential universities there. Her plans were to stay for half the year, get a job there, and basically scope out the potentials of setting down her roots in Nova Scotia. She was particularly interested in a law program at Dalhousie University. Now, her father Wayne was pretty hesitant about allowing his teenage daughter to fly across the country solo, but he had actually traveled at a young age, and Andrea would end up using that against him. Wayne saying, quote, "It was her big argument for being allowed to go traveling. Dad did it, so she could too. It was a lark for her to take the same backpack." End quote. And so eventually, Andrea would gain her parents' blessing for the trip. On New Year's Day in 1992, Andrea would end up packing her bags and flying from her home in New Westminster to Halifax in the maritime province of Nova Scotia, the same city that Kimberly McAndrew had disappeared from less than 2 years prior. After arriving at the Halifax Stanfield International Airport, she'd call a family member and leave a message that she'd arrived safely and that there was a lot of snow outside and said it looked cold. She'd end the message by saying that she would call them back the following day with an address of where she'd be staying at. After collecting her bags, Andrea's next steps would be to find a bus that would take her to the city to a youth hostel where she'd reserved a room. However, after this call, Andrea would never be seen or heard from again. 2 days later, when Andrea hadn't followed up, her mother would end up calling that youth hostel in a panic, trying to spell out her daughter's name to figure out if she had checked in. But it would turn out that she hadn't. By January 4th, when she still wasn't accounted for, Andrea's worried family would report her missing to the Surrey, BC RCMP. However, police in both British Columbia and Nova Scotia were not really worried about Andrea, unfortunately. They looked at it as she was an 18-year-old that had, decided to go on a vacation, and if she wanted to be missing, she could be, because she was of legal age. Police would essentially tell the family, and I quote, "Oh, these kids, they always show up," end quote. But her family insisted that she was not a runaway. If she could have called, she would have. And they had also realized that $800 was still sitting in her bank account untouched. So while police were twiddling their thumbs, Anne was busy trying to have the newspapers spread the word about her daughter's disappearance. And by February 14th, a newspaper called The Province would print a story on Andrea's disappearance. Anne would also campaign across the country on behalf of thousands of families with missing children. They'd also arranged for Crime Stoppers to include Andrea in an episode. However, I wasn't able to find that episode, so if you are, let me know down below. Now, unfortunately, since it took police so long to actually take this case seriously, once they did start investigating in Halifax, they honestly didn't find much at all. They were able to locate the payphone that Andrea had used at the airport, but that was literally it. Because police had taken so long, all of the security footage at the airport had already been written over. So it was all gone. They couldn't even try to find video footage of maybe where Andrea had gone, which direction she went, if she ever did get on that bus to the city, or who took her. If they had that footage, they may have been able to see if she got into a specific vehicle or if someone had been talking to her. After a year, the search would commence in both the British Columbia and Halifax area. But again, since police had taken so long, they weren't able to find any evidence or identify anyone who had contact with Andrea after she arrived in Nova Scotia. Andrea's parents would actually be extremely active in the search for trying to find their daughter, which I guess when the police aren't, you have to be. And that would be besides just trying to get the media to spread the word. They were literally boots on the ground, and they would travel across the country from areas like Halifax, Toronto, Montreal, because they were acting on a theory that Andrea had been trafficked. The family would plaster poster after poster across malls and cities, and would address meetings in school gyms and community centers, and saying, quote, "There have been several anonymous tips she could have been in Toronto, Montreal, or other large Canadian cities. The RCMP in Halifax have a theory my daughter may have been abducted and made to work as a prostitute. I'm here to learn about the prostitution situation, to see what that life is like, and to find out if there's any feasible theory. The other theory is homicide, and I'm not ready to accept that." End quote. At the end of the year, in December of 1992, Anne would still be quoted in papers saying that she still had hope that Andrea would be found. They even bought her a card for Christmas and put a check in it so that when she got home, they could give it to her. But sadly, just a couple weeks after Anne had talked about that in the newspaper, about how she was buying Christmas presents for her daughter and hoping she'd be coming home, on December 22nd, skeletal remains would be located in a wooded area in Lower Sackville, Nova Scotia, near the Sackville Business Park. Meanwhile, as Anne was baking Christmas cookies at her kitchen, a familiar RCMP officer would show up at her front door. At first, she thought that the officer was just stopping by to say Merry Christmas because it was only a couple days away, and she'd gotten very friendly with some of the officers over the year. However, he would stop by to tell her that he had bad news. Analysis would determine that the remains belonged to 18-year-old Andrea King. He'd tell the family that Andrea's remains were found by a duck hunter in a wooded area on the edge of the industrial park, which was just halfway between the airport and downtown, and not far from the freeway. She'd been identified by her dental records, along with the t-shirt and jacket she'd been wearing when she left Vancouver. However, the rest of her belongings were nowhere to be found. The officer would end up telling Anne that a knife had been used to cut Andrea's clothing, and her jeans had been cut in a way that suggested she had been essayed. They were also informed that Andrea's cause of death was most likely a blow to the front of her head. Just what an awful turn of events, that this family had just so much hope still that she was just out there, that she was being trafficked potentially, and that she'd be found and brought home for Christmas. They were baking Christmas cookies, buying her presents, and then just days before Christmas, they're told that she was found murdered and that she had been essayed before she was murdered. It's awful. It's honestly a worst nightmare situation. In January of 1993, just a year after Andrea had left home for her new adventure in life, her remains would be flown to Edmonton to be examined by another team of forensic experts. Meanwhile, 400 friends and family would gather at Holy Trinity Cathedral in New Westminster for a mass celebrating Andrea's spirit. Her mother Anne could be seen clutching one of Andrea's favorite panda toys during the service. RCMP would also sneak in 2 plainclothed officers to sit in the pews and observe if the killer could potentially be among them. As we know, killers sometimes like to show up at search parties, at funeral services, just kind of be around and insert themselves. So that's what the RCMP was doing. They were trying to see if, the killer was there, maybe hiding among the group. If there was just someone there that no one recognized possibly. And while that was happening, another officer was taking pictures of everyone at the service and the entire situation. After Mass, people would gather at Andrea's sister Deborah's home so that they could play music that she loved and share memories about her. Her sister Deborah saying, quote, "I cry when I think of Andrea's laughter. It's her laughter that really gets me. It's been a tough year, but to tell you the truth, I feel relieved. I didn't want to be one of those people who 20 years down the road still doesn't know how their loved one died." End quote. The priest who baptized Andrea after she was born would say to the Vancouver Sun, quote, "We do not yet know or even when she died, but this we do know. She had a right to live, a right that was deliberately and wrongfully taken from her." End quote. He would go on to say that he hoped police left no stone unturned until the homes and streets of their land were safe for all men and women, that the evil abuse, whether physical, sexual, or mental, were rooted out and destroyed from the streets and homes. And honestly, I couldn't have said it better myself. Now, with the information we have on Andrea's cause of death and the fact that she was most likely essayed due to the state of how she was found, I want to assume they would have done a essay kit on her. If it was possible after her body being out there for a year, I'm not sure. But all of that on top of the fact that she was found halfway between the airport and downtown, the most likely scenario to me is that after she got off the phone and was looking for transportation, someone may have approached her and offered her a ride to the city. Her family would insist that Andrea would have never hitchhiked with just anyone, and that if she ever was going to, it most likely would have been with an official, such as a taxi driver or potentially a police officer. or possibly someone pretending to be one of those individuals. They could have approached her and told her that, they were heading to town, that they could give her a ride there for free even, and that it would be no problem to them. They were just doing a good deed for a young girl in a new city that was all by herself, that didn't really know where she was going. As far as I know, she'd never been there before. I could be wrong. I just didn't ever see anything about her ever being there before. And maybe she accepted. Maybe the bus wasn't coming for a while. And so she thought, you know what? This will save some time and I'll get there early and I could start exploring early. However, that kind gesture would then lead Andrea to be taken to that wooded area because the highway from the airport to downtown Halifax, so all they would have had to do was pull off, and Andrea would have been in a very bad situation. However, Andrea's family insisted that she would have put up a fight as soon as she realized that this individual was pulling up in a dark, secluded industrial cul-de-sac where the woods began, that she may have tried to run, but sadly, the abductor would eventually murder her. Now, as I mentioned, there are connections between Kimberly McAndrew's case and Andrea's case, and that is because there is a suspect in common. And this suspect I went into great detail in Kimberly's case, so I'm just going to give a brief overview again here for the sake of not repeating myself, but that is on convicted sex offender Andrew Paul Johnson. In 1997, police would receive reports from 2 communities in British Columbia of a man who had twice tried to lure 12-year-old girls into his car claiming to be a police officer. His vehicle had Nova Scotia license plates. That's when they'd arrest 40-year-old Andrew Johnson, while he had a 20-year-old woman kidnapped and locked in the back of his car. When police searched his vehicle, he had what they described as an essay kit that comprised of porn magazines, a Halloween mask, handcuffs, a meat cleaver, lube, and packing tape. Andrew would later be described as having a volcanic sexual appetite. Now, it would turn out that Andrew actually had multiple items from teen girls in his possession, and police would later show photos of the items that they collected from Andrew's home to one of Andrea's sisters. Specifically, eyeshadow palettes were among these items in the photos, and her sister had no doubt that these were Andrea's makeup items. Now, it's never been proven that Andrew was the one that murdered Andrea, but when you put the dots together, it's very creepy and eerie. I would also like to know the exact time frame and timestamps of all of Andrew's whereabouts within these years. I want to guess he was in Halifax around that time or had the potential to be, or else why would police be considering him a suspect? But let's just bluntly look at this. There is proof that Andrew was pretending after he drove all the way across the country. I will say he drove across the country to go find his wife who had fled because she had accused him of SA. He drove across the country. That is psychotic behavior, to go find her and hunt her down in British Columbia. And while he was there, he was trying to lure off 12-year-old girls pretending to be a police officer. This man is very sick in the head. And since there is proof that this man would pretend to be a police officer in certain situations, was Andrew in Halifax at that time? And could he have been at the airport pretending to be a police officer? And could he have offered Andrea a ride? He might not even have been, in a uniform or anything. He could have just had a badge and told her, hey, I'm off duty right now, but I'm heading to the city. Do you want to ride? And Andrea might have trusted that and gotten into his vehicle. We also know that Andrea was SA'd. And we also know that Andrew also was an SA'er who carried around an SA kit in his vehicle. She also had blunt force trauma to the front of her head, which makes me wonder, hey, could that meat cleaver have been used? The parallels are just terrifying. And then on top of that, he'd apparently been caught with some of Andrea's belongings, or at least according to those photos and the items in the photos, they looked like Andrea's belongings. So in my opinion, he's definitely a really, really good suspect for this. Again, I would really like to know the time frames, however. Was he in the area at that time? Can he be placed there? The chances of him ending up with her belongings but not being involved seems very slim to me. In 2002, Andrea's parents were doing just what she'd asked of them. They go on to foster 2 young girls and were in the process of adopting them. The Kings would also specialize in caring for babies with fetal alcohol syndrome and other developmental problems. They go on to foster 90 children, and on top of that, they also asked for people to donate to the Andrea King Trust Fund, and the contributions went to agencies that help search for missing kids, such as Child Find and the Missing Children Society of Canada. They honestly seemed like such great people, and they didn't deserve to go through everything that they did, but they were carrying on Andrea's wishes, which is just so, so sweet. And saying, quote, Andrea left home in a pair of jeans, a jacket, $250 and a backpack, and she returned to us in an urn 11 months later, end quote. It's just really heartbreaking when you hear it in that perspective. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, just as I have been, with the evidence that police have and the circumstances surrounding Andrew Johnson's involvement, why isn't this case solved? Honestly, I don't really know. or at least they didn't know. However, I did end up finding an article that was written in 2013 where a similar question was asked. And this article reads, quote, "Rummaging through Johnson's life and times, police have found evidence linking him to King's disappearance, including her compact, her makeup. At the time, DNA testing wasn't sophisticated enough to positively connect the dots from Johnson to McAndrew or King, and police themselves lost interest after a BC court declared Johnson a dangerous offender in 2001. 3 years later, then Detective Tom Martin, who had run for mayor in 2012, joined the cold case squad and asked for a piece of DNA evidence he knew the task force had collected. He hoped testing advances might lead to the breakthrough investigators needed. However, the evidence had disappeared. Today, police are still seeking the public's help. There are any number of reasons, of course, why homicides don't get solved. But given the stunning numbers still on the books in Halifax, we need to ask if incompetence is one of those reasons." End quote. At the end of the day, it seems like police incompetence may be the reason that both Andrea and Kimberly's cases aren't solved. It seems like not only, especially in Andrea's case, did police just not look for her for a while, which means they lost a lot of evidence. They lost security footage, they lost people's memories, because again, she disappeared from an airport. So everyone is coming and going. The chances of someone seeing something or being familiar with something and actually paying attention to what's going on at the airport are very slim. It's not like, someone who has a routine and who is constantly somewhere and would notice something out of place. Everyone is just there going through the motions of coming and going. So no one's going to find it odd if a young girl is getting into a vehicle with someone. They'd probably just think that person's getting picked up by someone. And then on top of that, when someone tried to solve this case by using new technology, the evidence that they did have was mysteriously missing. It's extremely tragic and it's very frustrating because I think these two cases could be solved and here we are. And it says just what it says. After Andrew Johnson was apparently convicted in 2001, he was marked a dangerous offender. Police were like, well, at least I guess we know that he's gotten charged with something. Why are we going to put in more effort? It's crazy. It's honestly crazy to me. Again, they didn't take Andrea's case seriously from the start. They lost so much evidence, and now it seems like they lost even more, which is just, I'd be so mad. I would be so mad as a family member. It's ridiculous, and it's very crazy to me that people aren't held accountable when evidence goes missing. Why? Why is that? Andrea's case just overall is so tragic. She was just a young girl. She had just turned 18. She wanted to get her life started. She had so many plans, so much motivation. She finished school with honors, it seemed like, and she wanted to go and scope out a new potential area to set down roots and start her life. But instead, she literally landed at the airport and was brutally essayed and murdered. She didn't even get a chance to start exploring the city or start seeing what potentials she had and what paths she could take in life. I just can't imagine how terrified she was and just her last moments. It's just awful. And then the fact that her family found out just days before Christmas that she was murdered, it's all of the most awful things that you can imagine put into one case. I guess at least at the end of the day, he's not on the streets anymore, or at least I hope he's never on the streets anymore. I don't know, in Canada, they like to rehabilitate people and just send them out there. In my opinion, someone like Andrew Johnson can be rehabilitated. Let me know how you feel about that. I think there's potentials to rehabilitate certain, people that commit crimes. But when it comes to like a serial killer or a violent sex offender like him, who is a serial assayer, I just think slam the door, throw away the key. I don't think that's safe. I would not feel comfortable for myself or my sister or my future children to be walking the streets with someone like that out there. But what do you all think? Do you think Andrew Johnson could have done something to both Kimberly and Andrea? After going through both of these videos and the connections in both, I'm really curious how you're feeling because it was a rabbit hole for me. And every case I go through, I'm always shocked that I've never heard of it before. And I continue to hope that these cases get new eyes and new ears because, again, I've never heard of them either. And I have been watching true crime for probably over a decade now. So to think that there's still so many cases out there that I've never even heard the names of these people of or heard the names of the suspects, it's wild to me. So I'll be in the comment section down below chatting with you all about these two cases. Let me know if there's any cases you want me to look into. I'll be starting to look into more of those cases in the new year. And my heart goes out to this family. They've went through so much and I give them a virtual hug. They really, truly fought for her. And also Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to you all. This video is going to be posted around the same time as this case took place in 1992. So just keep Andrea and her family in your thoughts. And as always, I hope you all stay safe out there. Lock your windows and doors, and I hope to see you in the next video.